What's up, everybody? I'm Katie,
And I'm Morgan.
and this is For Your Misinformation. We are two Midwestern feminists here to break down the political news that you need to know without the misinformation that you don't.
Let us break down the problem and tell you what we're doing and what you can do to help solve it.
Hi, Morgan.
Hey, Katie.
What's up? How are you?
Feeling grateful that I, at this point, and no one I love has died from COVID because there have been a whole lot of deaths. So I guess I'm good. I'm grateful. I'm in the Thanksgiving spirit. How are you?
Yeah, I mean, in COVID adjusted terms, I'm pretty good. I did find out that my cousin tested COVID positive, but she's young and healthy. She's a little bit younger than me and doing well so far. So, yeah, feel pretty lucky, but also reminder that it's a very real thing that's very much still happening and in fact is happening more than it has ever in the United States so far. So if you're acting differently than you were at the height of your precautions, why?
Yeah, I'm concerned about early December, what numbers we're going to see from people who kind of just went all over the place over Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
I hope, and I mean, we'll find out if people have been smart and safe.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot say it enough. It is patriotic to give a damn about your fellow Americans.
Yeah.
Wear a mask, stay home, save lives.
I remember feeling this way about St. Patrick's Day. Like, I remember being like, oh no, like just being able to feel like an impending. And like, I felt that. I didn't think I was going to feel that for every single holiday after St. Patrick's Day, but it's happening. It's like, oh no, it's just like you can see a car accident about to happen and there's like nothing you can do about it except try and keep your friends and family away from it.
I just remember in March being bummed that St. Patrick's Day was canceled and being like, you know what though? We'll just celebrate it in July when this is over. Oh, what a sweet summer child I
You
was.
meant next July.
Yeah.
Which is possible. We'll celebrate two St. Patrick's Days next July.
I mean, by that point, everybody will have either gotten a vaccine or some kind of natural immunity or probably died.
Right. Can't wait.
Super.
Great. Which we're okay. Sorry that we're talking about something so traumatic so flippantly, but like that's what this is. We're all collectively going through trauma, which is what we want to talk about today. Also, sometimes we deal with trauma with humor, and we're not sorry about it.
I make jokes about my own trauma all the time.
Yes.
So, I made one today about my chronic illness. I'm sorry.
Whatever people need to do to get through, okay?
Look, it floats my boat.
Right. So we should talk about trauma and ACEs specifically. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It really originated in a study in the mid-90s that was done between the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Kaiser Permanente Healthcare Organization in California. So people really like when they refer to that, they call it the ACEs study. It had like almost 18,000 participants, and really what they did is they surveyed what various forms of physical and emotional abuse in children, which is sad to talk about, of course, but there were some really, really important and interesting findings of those studies. One, ACEs are very common. So we'll read the ACEs questionnaire a little in just a minute, but it centers on different types of abuse and neglect, and it's more common than people realize. Even among middle class people and wealthier people, more than 2/3 of the population reports experiencing at least one ACE. And I think when we read it, you'll see that it's easier. I mean, even having divorced parents counts as one ACE. And so if your parents got divorced before the age of 18, you have at least one ACE. So you and I are in the club, which is not to say that people who have experienced trauma will go on to have poorer health outcomes or anything like that. It's not like a sentence, but it's data and it's useful to work with.
Right. It's an indicator. And in
Yes.
public health, when we talk about indicators, we talk about, things that increase likelihood, things that, make something more likely to happen. It's correlated, not necessarily, causal. So you probably have heard people go on and on about correlation, not causation. There's elements of both of those when we talk about things related to trauma, related to ACEs, and yeah. So like, if we're going along this and you're resonating too much with things, don't think that we're giving you any kind of sentence or, saying that everybody is the same. It's super nuanced. And again, all of this research was from 1995. So not that research hasn't been ongoing, but there very likely may be changes we should be making to the ACE questionnaire to...
One of them is definitely bullying.
Yeah.
Like bullying is traumatic.
Yeah.
And there's nothing in there. Well, we'll read it. Okay, we'll read it in just a second. But nearly a quarter of people have experienced 3 or more. There's a very powerful and persistent correlation between the more ACEs experienced and the greater the chance of poorer health outcomes and other outcomes later in life, including dramatically increased risk of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, depression, substance abuse, smoking, poor academic achievement, time out of work, and early death. That's crazy, and that's why we have to frame trauma as a public health issue and a public health crisis, because that's what it is. And that is, I didn't learn about trauma in school. I learned about it in like a continuing education training while I worked for a local health department, but it was taken like this was a huge like aha moment for me that is part of the reason that there's a whole episode about it. But it's just, I don't know, as soon as I learned about trauma and the effect that it has on people later in life, it's like, oh, just be fucking nice to everybody. Like, life is hard.
Yeah. Yeah,
exactly.
Nice. And like anybody who's ever experienced trauma knows that sometimes that begets more trauma, and things really pile up, as well as with it being such a public health crisis, having chronic illness, having heart attacks, stroke, diabetes, those kinds of things end up being expensive, which can also lead to a whole bunch of problems. It's certainly not going to make things better, especially if your situation's already put you in a position where you're maybe uninsured or underinsured, or you live in America where things are so healthcare is sometimes unattainable or unable to be, afforded, unaffordable.
Yeah.
I don't know what language I'm looking for here. But yeah, it's it can end up being such a cycle, and it's an important thing for us to talk about in public health, but also education and everything. It really comes into everything. We're going to talk about like a trauma-informed care approach a lot throughout this. And, I definitely want to tell everybody, like, keep listening, whether you are somebody who works in public health or medicine or education or social work or retail, like, listen, a trauma-informed approach isn't just for public health, and it's not just for politics. It's for everyone.
And especially, I think medical settings can be really scary. So I think especially if you're in a medical setting, I'm sure you've probably already heard of trauma-informed care, but it's really, really important. You want to alternate reading. So the ACEs questionnaire has 10 questions on it. Like, essentially, it's never have I ever. You put sorry, that's not funny. But you put a finger down, or you count it as a point each time you answer yes to a question. Nobody but you needs to ever know your score on the ACEs questionnaire. You don't ever need to tell anybody. It's pretty rude to ask somebody else theirs. If they want to share it, that's pretty vulnerable of them. But we'll just go through and we'll alternate. But keep in mind that like these are things. So if any of these things happen to you before the age of 18, the more of them that happen to a person, the more likely they are to have all those poor health outcomes that we mentioned earlier. Okay,
Yeah.
so the first one, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was also going to say, and if you were over the age of 18 when these things happen to you, it doesn't mean that they're not still going to, impact your life seriously. It's just that this particular ACE questionnaire came out of research that was only done for, pertaining to experiences before the age of 18.
Yeah.
So,
and your brain doesn't
I want to
stop
clarify
developing
that
until you're 25. So maybe there's no cutoff at 18.
Yeah. Yeah. Trauma doesn't stop being trauma because you're over 18 or over 25.
Yeah. But if it happens before the age of 18, it affects the way your brain develops. And we'll talk about that later. Okay. So number 1 is, did a parent or other adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or act in any way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt?
Number 2, did a parent or other adult in your household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you or ever hit you so hard you had marks or were injured?
Did a parent or other adult in the household ever touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way?
Did you often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or feel like your family didn't look out for each other?
Did you often feel like you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take you to the doctor if you needed it?
Number 6, were your parents ever divorced or separated?
Number 7, was your mother or stepmother subjected to physical domestic abuse? That one's interesting. That one's a very clear indicator of the 90s because, hey, men can be subjected to domestic physical abuse also.
Number 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or who used street drugs? Also, 90s, the term street drugs. Does anybody ever use that word anymore?
Did you have a skip it? No, sorry, that's not one of them. But yes, I have a skip it. Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide?
And number 10, did a household member go to prison?
So that's all 10 of them. Again, You don't need to tell anybody, but you probably have a number in your head. I mean, I can't imagine hearing this quiz. I mean, the first time I heard about it, I was going through adding up my score, of course. So
yep. And, quick moment that, you'll notice that nothing about race is on here. Again, the 90s, they thought racism was over back then. We know that it's not. That should obviously be on there, something about race and racial trauma, or again, even just looking at it as it is, going through the lens of these experiences as a white person is very different than a Black person or an Indigenous person or, someone of another race.
Right. Yeah. So trauma-informed care is just the idea that once you realize how common trauma is, then you start to understand that every person you encounter may have experienced some kind of serious trauma, and we don't need to question those people's experiences. Just assume that they may have this history and then act accordingly. Like I said, life is hard, just be nice to people. But what you brought up with race is something that should be constantly on everybody's mind. But historical trauma and generational trauma are really, really important to think about also. So those events, some of those events are acute things that happen once. Black Americans have the very unique history of being taken from the land that they were on ships. Many of them died, were treated horribly, were enslaved, were constantly told that they were not worth as much as other humans that didn't look like them. That's very unique historical generational trauma, and same especially with Indigenous Americans. A bunch of white people came over.
Your culture was stolen from you and beaten out of you. I mean, literally, Native children were taken from their homes and put into schools to make them more like the colonizers who were, destroying their land and their people. And there are so many records of this. And even if it happened in 1619 or 1850 or whenever, that creates generational and historical trauma. And it's not just an easy thing to erase and go away. Little platitudes like Black Lives Matter Black Lives Matter is important, but a company giving everyone a Black Lives Matter sticker doesn't erase that And, again, that's another reason why it's important to recognize historical trauma and generational trauma and, have a trauma informed approach.
Yeah. The exciting thing, I think, well, yeah, is just that once I started thinking, like, once I understood trauma, I guess, like, policies, like, social welfare policies made way more sense. And that's basically the answer. We'll talk about them at the end, but like it's just, I don't know, there's just something about this like makes it so clear. But yeah, so keep in mind that there are certain groups that have unique, painful generational trauma that like we'll never be able to understand. So just assume that, just be kind.
Right. And like, we're not going to really talk about it in this episode, but epigenetics is something that people talk about a lot too. And, some of the research there has been on the children who were born of mothers who survived the Holocaust and, how they developed differently or what types of markers they had that was different from children who were born at the same time, but whose parents were not having to hide from Nazis. And, other epigenetics obviously can apply to any group. That's just kind of an example of the first time I read about it personally, but we're not going to talk about it. There's a lot of interesting things you can read about it out there. Sometimes it's considered like a controversial science or a very unclear thing. But so, just go ahead and find that. We're not going to talk about that here a whole lot in relation to generational trauma.
Collective trauma, 9/11 is a really good example of collective trauma. We're currently going through collective trauma, like pandemic trauma, like uniquely in the United States because our government has essentially decided not to try and help us. The Senate went home. Like, nobody gives a shit. Nobody. So, yeah. So, I guess the way that I think about it too is like, we're experiencing like 11 months of this pandemic trauma where it's like, oh yeah, our government really doesn't give a shit about us. Imagine living with like, especially if you had like a black son, like you were like a mother, like sending her son out into the world every morning, and commonly at traffic stops, they just got murdered. Like, to live with that level of toxic stress, like, we're all getting a teeny tiny, itty bitty, minuscule dose of that right now. Imagine having to live with that your whole life, and just like, yeah, they get shown constantly that their government doesn't give a shit about them. There's counter protesters to Black Lives Matter. Matter? They're mad. Matter. They're mad that we're saying matter. Like, it's insane.
Yep. And I think that, it's a good time to remember empathy. Even if you don't necessarily understand, I can guarantee you I don't understand what it feels like to be Black ever, especially right now. But, empathy and just like listening makes a big difference. So
empathy for people, whether they look like you or not.
Yeah.
Please. Okay, so why do ACEs matter? They have a tremendous impact on future violence victimization and perpetration. They also have lifelong health and opportunity gaps. When you have communities that are safe, where like every child can thrive, where there's like lighting and the roads are taken care of and there's a park for them to play in and the air is clean and the water is clean, that's where people can thrive. And children can thrive. So if you experience this kind of trauma or toxic stress, your brain develops differently and your stress response center is different. Your fight, flight, or freeze response basically becomes hypersensitive. Like, you become not so great at identifying real risks versus perceived risks, and you switch from your like higher functioning brain into your lizard brain like really, really quickly, whether that threat is actually a threat to you right now or not.
Right. Like, a person that's had to fight for survival is going to be more likely to kind of be in survival mode rather than prefrontal cortex mode. And especially early in life, ACEs impact your ability to self-regulate, which is a huge indicator for future success. A child that has been able to learn self-regulation by the time they're, 9 or 10 is just so much more likely to have success in their future than a child who has not been given the freedom to do that.
And please don't tell me that 9-year-old child needs to pull itself up by its bootstraps and teach itself emotional regulation. They have no control over this, of course, and this early adversity dramatically affects health outcomes across the lifetime, and early interventions are really, really important. Thankfully, there are a lot, but I want to talk more about these like crazy statistics. So yeah, they're super, super common. 1 in 8 people have 4 or more ACEs. If you have 4 or more ACEs, you are 2.5 times more likely to develop COPD. You're 4.5 times more likely to be depressed. You are 12 times more likely to die by suicide. It's a public health crisis, and we should start framing it that way, especially because once you frame things as public health crises, there's frameworks to fix them.
Yep. And as people have maybe noticed with the current pandemic we're living in, public health crises, whatever, are expensive and can lead to more traumatic events. They end up with people having, more distrust in institutions often. I mean, a public health crisis is never a good thing, no matter what it is. And maybe we should make sure to do things about them, especially if we can prevent them.
Yes. That's really all that public health is. It's a bunch of anxious people worrying about what's going to happen in the future and trying to fix it, and then a bunch of politicians not listening to them.
Yeah, and a lot of people saying things like, well, I know somebody who was molested when they were 3 and they turned out fine, so we don't need to do anything about this. And you're like, okay, here's the thing. 1, that's an awful thing to just like talk about really flippantly. How do you know that they're quote unquote fine? Also, you're bringing an individual solution and an individual situation into a systemic problem. That doesn't work. That has never worked.
My grandma used to do this a lot.
Yeah, people do it all the time with things. I mean, I know I probably do with certain things too, right? But, we hear that a lot with the Black Lives Matter movement too. And, people saying like, well, I know this Black person who's doing really well. We had a Black man as president. You're just like, okay, let me try to explain to you what we mean when we're talking about an issue being systemic. And then we'll actually get to the issue. But first, we're going to have to look at our whole approach differently. How much time you got?
Yeah. Yes. So one of my favorite sayings, if you can predict it, you can prevent it. And actually, local health departments are providing a lot of these services, but like, there are gaps for sure. Like, people get left out, but like home visits, care coordination, like nutrition services. I mean, the nutrition that the foods that you have access to, if you have like SNAP, are influenced by lobbyists, unfortunately, and they shouldn't be. Like, there are definitely healthier selections, but like, okay, something is better than nothing, but also it's crazy that the food that our growing children get is influenced because like Mott's apple juice is really good at lobbying or whatever. But anyway, I guess that's a topic for another episode. Anyway.
Yeah.
Like and then sometimes medication is necessary, but like education for parents about the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress will go a long way. And if we gave a shit about better health outcomes in America, that's what we would invest in. But we don't. We care about profit.
Right. Like, imagine if we just built systems that prevented trauma in the first place, but like so many other things in public health, there's not profit in prevention, at least not through our current model of capitalism. But if we if we look at the benefit of the outcomes of people in our country as something that you cannot or should not put a financial value on, then it shouldn't matter. Financially, we know it would have huge economic benefits to address or prevent ACEs. And, so really there is a dollar value to be put to prevention. There is. It's just not the kind of dollar value that lines the pockets of the 1%.
Right. Which is kind of gets back to what we were talking about last week with Jared Kushner, is like he operates exclusively to benefit his shareholders, even though he has thousands of tenants. All he cares about is the shareholders of Kushner Company, who like 50% of Americans don't have any stocks at all. Most of them are definitely not like shareholder level of like, it's just not what needs to be focused on. It's not what needs help. It's not what needs bailing out by the government at any point. But like,
yeah, I don't care how the stock market is doing. I care how the American people are doing.
Right. So if you address stuff like this, or you provide for like basic needs or something, like the money that you would be saving is on like doctor's bills if a kid grows up in a home that doesn't have black mold and the air quality is good and there wasn't any like exposure to any kind of something while they were in the womb because the water is clean. They wouldn't develop asthma, and then they wouldn't need doctor's visits, and they wouldn't need asthma medication. Like that's the kind of stuff that you have to look like far downstream to see the money saved. But that's better for society as a whole, because like Morgan said, even if you're not thinking about them on like an individual level, on a societal level, you want a healthy society, and it's better for even for the economy. Like it's just better. And okay, this is what I think about every time I hear, I know I brought this up already, but every time I hear conservatives talk about personal responsibility, this is all that I think about, because we are not starting from anywhere near an even playing field. And I know that this is kind of reductive, but you can kind of think about like whether a child experience ACEs is like the soil that a tree is going to grow in. And like you can grow a healthy tree in shitty soil, but there need to be other like interventions. Like you're going to need to put more work in. Like this tree over here that was born into soil that was already like nutrient rich and whatever, and this one over here that has rocks in it, like you can make it okay, but there's going to be more. You're going to have to put more effort in to make that tree like reach the potential that it can. But it's better for that farmer to put that in so that they have two trees that are producing lemons and are very happy. I don't know why they're lemon trees, but does that make sense?
Or happy trees. Yes, I love it.
Yes.
More happy trees, only let's have our happy trees like intentionally.
Yes.
No shade at Bob Ross, but
no. So yeah, I think about that, and then how like if the government can pay as much as they do for like police and military budgets, they can provide basic services for their citizens like guaranteed housing and Medicare for all. Like when we say defund the police, the follow up to that is fund universal childcare, fund Medicare for all, fund the Green New Deal. It's not just the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do.
Yeah, like imagine how many fewer police and militarized police vehicles we would need if we actually had programs that were proven to prevent violence and crime, which we have those programs. We just don't like institute them or don't do them properly. And
we can't even get Republicans to acknowledge climate change. Like, right. It's sad, but we're not even like on the same planet.
Yeah. And like, again, very individualized type of approach or, comment anecdote here, but like the early lives of some of the most important people in my life were traumatic as fuck. I mean, as traumatic as you can get. A score of 10. But those people whom I love had to fight and claw and just try like hell to end up having relatively normal adult lives, although of course still filled with, heartbreak and the impacts of trauma. But wouldn't it be nice if they didn't have to do that? Wouldn't it be nice if we had systems in place so it didn't have to be so hard? And, and these people if they had been Black with the childhoods that they had, especially in the time at which they had these childhoods, it most certainly would have been 100 times worse. And for a quote unquote, civilized, westernized country, it should be unacceptable to have people who do not get taken care of when they need it.
But that's socialism.
I don't care.
I also don't care. And the reason that I don't care is because the military is also socialism. Socialism is taking a percentage of people's resources and individual private citizens' resources and redistributing it for the greater good. You don't want to have your own personal military. You don't need it. So we have pooled our resources and we've created our own. And that's enough of that because it's not going well. Let's put those resources towards some evidence-based things that actually work. And let's just have trauma-informed everything.
Yes, I love it. Trauma-informed everything.
The other reason that I strongly support these, the important thing basically is that it doesn't affect all people equally. Women, American Indians, Alaskan Natives, Black Americans have a higher risk of experiencing 4 or more types of childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and BIPOC people's mental health is often taken less seriously. So a Black person or a Native American person exhibiting signs of mental health generally don't get the care that they would receive if their skin was white. And they're also the people who tend to experience the most trauma and have generally the highest impacts on things from physical health to ability to hold a job to SES, to mass incarceration. And like, this is something that has only recently been researched and talked about by the white scientific community, but that does not make it a new phenomenon.
I also want to mention that the Trump administration is not just, they're causing all kinds of trauma, but very, very like intense acute trauma for the migrant families that are being traumatized at the border. They had a deal to pay for the mental health care of these families. In October 2019, the Justice Department strongly supported an $8 million settlement deal to provide mental health screenings and counseling to thousands of migrant families who'd been separated by the Trump administration. And then the Office of the White House Counsel, at the direction of Stephen Miller, of course, I cannot wait for him to be obscure. I hope we never have to talk about him again. So he pulled the plug. He was like, nah, I don't think these people whose lives I've ruined, especially these like children, need these mental health services now. So the judge in the case ultimately ordered the government to pay for the mental health services, but Miller's torching of the deal created a 6-month delay, and that cost taxpayers $6 million, and it also prevented nonprofit services from reaching everybody affected, and some of the families were already deported in the meantime. So they're creating trauma and also just creating this, like, it's just a great way to make people fucking hate America, which is the same thing that the Muslim ban did, but it's so sad.
Yeah, it is sad. And I was listening to, a podcast that was talking about trauma recently, and they talked about like big T trauma, which are those huge events, trauma with a capital T, and little t trauma, which might be like smaller events. They might, just kind of be almost seem normal by the person experiencing those traumas. And I think that that's such an interesting but critical thing to think about, is the way that these big T traumas and these little T traumas are going to affect people. Again, affecting people differently. It's not all the same. It's not all experienced the same. Also thinking about clinically diagnosed trauma, like PTSD. That is definitely trauma, but that's usually also the first thing people think of when they think of trauma. And that's a big T trauma, but those little T traumas are still traumas. Microaggressions, macroaggressions, those in between level of aggressions, right? All of those things are trauma. All of those traumas are different in different situations. They're different across different cultures, different individuals. none of them are invalid and none of them are a sign of weakness. And we need to make sure that we're talking about all of these types of trauma in all of the ways and just deepen our understanding of trauma, because it, now in 2020 is so much different than it was when we first recognized PTSD in young men who were returning from Vietnam or Korea. And it does not invalidate those experiences to talk about all of these other types of trauma. Mm-hmm. Just like sometimes people like to think that by talking about white privilege, you're invalidating the experiences of white people who are affected by poverty or have had struggles in their lives. That's not how it works. So there's just so much to be done. There's so much that still needs to be researched and learned about. There's so many different approaches that might be necessary in terms of, addressing trauma, correcting trauma. But I feel like, I don't know, I feel like even though we're talking about trauma and that's like deep, that we're getting to a really hopeful point in the episode where we get to talk about like what we can do and the fact that we know there's all of these things we can do. Yeah. That's big, right? Especially compared to a lot of things that seemingly have no answers.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I want to say that it is whatever, if you've experienced trauma, whatever your reaction to that trauma is, that is the right reaction. And nobody else can predict anybody else's reaction. There is nothing wrong with you. That is something that happened to you, but it does have like a net negative effect on society. So if you are not the kind of person who can empathize and extend that feeling to people who aren't you or people who don't look like you, it's just better for everybody as a whole to have a society that is less traumatized. So yeah, these health, they're preventable. Preventing childhood trauma could potentially prevent 1.9 cases of coronary heart disease a year, which is the leading killer in this country. It could also prevent 2.5 million cases of obesity, and 21 million cases of depression. Well, speaking of obesity, I don't really know if we mentioned this earlier, but part of the reason that people who experience trauma have poorer health outcomes is because they turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms to make themselves feel better, like food or like drugs or alcohol. Healthy coping mechanisms would be like journaling or exercising or talking to a therapist. So some of these health outcomes have to do with what choice of coping skill you went with, but also, like we said, it impacts your body and your brain also. But it can also affect a person's social well-being. So ACEs they also negatively affect life opportunities like completing high school or future employment, and preventing ACEs could keep up to 1.5 million students from dropping out of school. So there's just this net positive effect for society. So what do we do?
Good thing is that there are some solutions. Nothing overnight, as I feel like listeners have probably recognized. Most solutions don't just happen quickly, but I think we can get there. I'm feeling hopeful.
Yeah. So we prefer evidence-based public policies. These can help to shape societal norms, which concern public health issues, and that's what we hope we're doing, and we hope you guys go do with your friends and families and networks. But there have been basically like all of the improvements in life expectancy in the last like century have been thanks to public health. You're welcome. Stuff like tobacco control and like seatbelts, controlling infectious diseases with vaccines. All of that stuff is public health. So we should start implementing policies that focus on preventing traumatic events whenever possible and providing early intervention services for survivor communities that are at risk of poor post-trauma outcomes, and also at reducing stigma. Because like we talked about, most people have experienced ACEs. I would even say that the estimate that they gave at the beginning is probably pretty low. There are currently a couple overarching mental health policy challenges that face communities and countries plagued by violence and trauma, which ours is. But because these trauma and mental health issues are inextricably linked, there's also lots of other challenges. But we know that trauma-informed care should be the default. And we know that a lot of people's problematic behaviors are the result of trauma, and that we should probably start treating them as things that need to be like something that needs help, and need some behaviors that need to be treated instead of addressing them as like willful or punishable actions. And like policies that would do that is Medicare for all, or housing as a basic human right. We talked about how housing organizer Richie Torres really believes in housing as a basic human right because that provides the like stability for children where they otherwise might not have any. But also universal child care, that would do a lot to help especially single mothers. Common sense gun control would reduce a lot of trauma. The Green New Deal would reduce a lot of future trauma. The climate emergency is going to have incredibly traumatic effects, especially on, lower income. Of course, the communities that are already vulnerable. But that's where we need to go.
Yeah, I feel like before I really learned a lot about public health, before I learned about ACEs, and really, like, I guess maybe when I was quite a bit younger and stuff, I thought, like, part of what makes a country great is freedom, right? We all have our freedom. Okay, that's awesome, except for, do we? Do the people in a country that doesn't take care of their citizens really have freedom? And when you look at other countries that are also free countries where the people have their freedom, the country also is taking care of their people, and that makes a pretty big difference, right? America comparatively has a lot of violence, has a lot of sick people, has a lot of people with untreated mental illness, has a lot of homeless people, has a lot of just problems that are kind of chalked up to being people's personal responsibility to fix. But a person's individual action isn't going to change a systemic problem.
Right. And you can put that on a bumper sticker because we probably say that every episode, and it becomes more true every time.
Us on that. Doesn't mean we're still not going to try as individuals, but as individuals, we have to recognize we're trying to change a systemic problem. Yeah, we're trying to change systems.
Right. So those systems, like those preventative efforts, are going to be different depending on the trauma. People need to be creative, especially policymakers. But yeah, okay. So like highway safety officials who are concerned with traffic accidents could be talking about trauma, working on trauma. University officials that are concerned with sexual assaults. Government officials that are in areas of high risk for natural disasters. That's what emergency preparedness is about. And yeah, given the global nature of trauma, we should probably start to adopt, some culturally appropriate practices. But climate change is a huge threat also. This cat wants my dinner so bad.
Oh, kitten.
So that's what we need. Why don't we have that already? Well, we only have probably 8 people in Congress who like really understand the plight of the working class. Our Congress, the demographic breakdown of our Congress, the average age of a congressional leader in both chambers is 60. Percentage of women serving in Congress is 24.2%. The percentage of people of color serving... The percentage of people of color serving in Congress is 24.3%. The percentage of members of Congress who are millionaires is 48%. Half of the people in Congress are millionaires.
That's insane. I guarantee you 48% of the people that you know are not millionaires.
No.
So why are 48% of the people making the decisions for you and the people you know millionaires?
Right. And the people who do understand, like, who are mad that the Senate went home for Thanksgiving, even though there's no deal reached for American businesses or American people. The ones that give a shit about the working class are Cori Bush, who actually hasn't even been sworn in yet. She just is
Yeah.
a congresswoman elect. But
Yeah.
AOC is pissed about it. Like, they're working class people who understand what matters. And both of them actually, I don't know. Congress doesn't look like our country, and that has to change because representation matters and representation affects policymaking. So we need our Congress to look like the American people. I want to shout out Brand New Congress because they supported both of those campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I didn't actually throw them any money this week, but follow them on social media and stuff. Keep an eye out for them because they fully understand that, like, almost all of Congress gotta go. Like, they gotta either gotta fall in line or they gotta go. And it seems like they're not falling in line, so they gotta go. And some of them have already made it into Congress. Like, Brand New Congress has already gotten people elected. So let's hope we can keep that going. Is there anything else you wanted to say about trauma before we start talking about what we're doing this week for activism and other
Yeah, I
stuff?
just think, there's so much great research out there on trauma. And just, if you're interested, try to learn a little bit more about it. I don't know about necessarily during pandemic times, but there are trauma-informed care trainings and things like mental health first aid and, a lot of different programs often offered through health departments or local agencies. There's all sorts of ways, to learn about things that just can kind of make you feel maybe a little bit more educated. And I don't know, just continuing to have conversations about trauma and thinking about it and listening to the people who know their stuff is so important. Just also taking care of yourself a little bit because right now we're all experiencing some collective trauma.
For sure.
In at least one way.
Absolutely. So what's your activism for the week? What are you up to?
Well, I think it's, time to stretch those old donation muscles for donating to the campaigns in Georgia. And since I don't have a printer, I'm also going to be able to do the postcards to swing states, which is so much easier for me as a person without a printer.
Right.
So that's really exciting. But yeah, I think that's kind of the next big thing to target is let's try to complete the Flip Georgia, Turn Georgia Blue trifecta.
I think that's probably what we're going to say every week between now and January 5th is donate money or volunteer. There will be, Indivisible has 2 phone banking days dedicated just to calling Georgia. When those get closer, we'll put the signups in our link tree and in the bio, but we'll also put the link to postcards to swing states in our bio, which is what Morgan's talking about. They send you order however many you want. I think 100 was like $18, and then they send it to you. You get an email with however many addresses on it, and then you write them, you ship them right around Christmas time. And
the stamps for postcards are only 35 cents.
Good point. It's cheaper. Yep. So if you don't have a printer and you don't want to do stuff with Vote Forward, Postcards to Swing States is the perfect way to get involved. So yeah. And that's what we're going to say every week between now and January 5th. We might tell you about some phone banking or text banking opportunities too, but pretty sure those are going to be our answers. Give them money, volunteer your time. Can we talk about how yesterday on The Bachelorette, Tayshia and Ivan talked about Black Lives Matter and what it's like growing up in America as a mixed race person. And It was maybe like my favorite moment in all of Bachelor Nation history.
It was very cool. Like, it was really neat. It's just,
I was surprised.
you usually just see really shallow discussions on The
Yes.
Bachelor or things that maybe do get a little deep, but not in a meaningful way,
Mm-hmm.
I think, collectively, for it being a TV show that like tons of people watch.
Yeah.
It was really cool.
Yeah. And not
Yeah.
that this is the same, but next week there's already a preview that Bennett is like coming for Noah's lack of emotional intelligence. And I cannot wait to hear a grown man tell another grown man to get his shit together. Like, thank you for not making some poor woman in Noah's life have to explain this to him, because that's not our jobs. We should not have to explain emotional intelligence to every man that we date in our 20s.
Yeah, it's very true. And even though Bennett and Noah are both white men, it also reminded me of just some interactions that I've seen on social media lately with white folks who should just go on parlay instead, but they still insist on being in spaces where, frankly, I don't think they belong. Whatever. And being really racist and gross. And I have seen so many people actually be like allies or actually stand up and be
Yay.
like, out of here with that nonsense. And it's been really refreshing. It's been great. One of them was defending an absolutely trash person, and they were still like, look, this person is trash, but you still can't use that word to talk to them just because they're black. And then the person that said it was like, okay, but I'm black. But I love to see white folks sticking their neck out there, even for people who are trash. And those are such small things, but it's kind of that reminder that, like, you as a white person, you don't have anything to lose by calling out bullshit of your fellow Caucasians when you see it. Let's make sure we're doing that.
Yeah, for
You
sure.
know, it's not up to your black coworker to explain to your white coworker why what they said was racist or problematic. It's not
And
up to
they're more
them
likely
to
to
shrug
listen
it
to
off.
you.
Right, exactly. It's not up to your black coworker to shrug it off or convince themselves that your white coworker who just said something racist wasn't directing it at them or wasn't trying to be awful or was just misinformed because they're old. No. Like, that's not it. We don't get to say that we believe Black Lives Matter and then see someone say stuff about Black Lives not mattering and not call that out.
Yep.
And you could do that without being aggressive, but if you got to be aggressive, go ahead and do it. Just, you can start nicely.
Yep.
I personally, as a Midwestern girl, like the passive aggressive approach.
Mm-hmm.
I got it from my mama. Relatively high success rate.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I
I
mean,
just
you do
wanted to
whatever you
say
gotta
that.
do.
I've enjoyed seeing that, especially with things in the pandemic just getting so bad. And sometimes people stop talking about race issues when they're too busy talking about coronavirus. And racism hasn't gone away because Joe Biden is elected and Kamala Harris is going to be our vice president. Like,
yeah, for sure. All right. Well, what about? Do you have anything lighter? I have a foster. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say my only lighter form of activism is building cat houses for the feral cat colony.
Oh.
It is really hard to find thin enough insulation that fits properly or that I can make fit properly the way I want it to fit. I'm like building them out of Rubbermaid totes, and I was going to line them with like insulation from, I was hoping like a styrofoam cooler, but I think I'm going to have to actually go get like professional grade insulation from the like professional corner at Menards or Lowe's or something rather than just being able to get something at Walmart. But because I want to like hot glue the insulation to the sides and the top and the floor of the cat house and then put like hot glue carpet over that so it's nice and soft, and then put a blanket in there. I'm building cat houses for my feral cats. It's going to be awesome, and everybody should do it if you think you might have some wild animals in your neighborhood who just need a nice warm place to sleep. Or if you live in the Des Moines area and you want to help me with these cats, let me know.
No, that sounds fun. My fun update is kitten related also. 2 of them did not get adopted last week, so we just get to snuggle for a whole nother week, which is fine with me.
They are the snuggliest, sweetest little noodle babies.
Yeah, they're pretty great. They are they're just so chill and cuddly. I love them.
Yeah. So anybody in the Chicago area listening, you should adopt these 2 because they're fantastic. Everybody have a good week. Stay home. Do your Christmas shopping online. A lot of small businesses have things set up so you can still shop small, but shop online.
Black-owned businesses. Be intentional when you spend your money.
Yep. Small businesses, Black-owned businesses. Yeah. Double check all the Etsy shops to make sure they don't sell like anti-vaxxer mugs or, Trump apparel first. I definitely almost purchased from an anti-vaxxer once.
They're everywhere.
Ugh, they are. So, yeah.
All right. Well, then you guys have, I guess Thanksgiving will be over by the time you listen to this.
I hope your pie is not all gone yet and you're still enjoying some leftovers.
Yeah. And we will talk to you guys next week.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you guys so much for listening to For Your Misinformation. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you like it, give us a rating and a review.
It helps us find more listeners, and the more of us there are, the better. And make sure you follow us on Instagram and Twitter at FYMI Pod.
Shout out to Ben Schlofelt for the audio production, Hope Dye for the podcast art, Kyle Dibdahl for the intro and outro music, and Adam Roston, who edits these videos every week so you can watch them on YouTube.
We come out with new episodes every Monday.